Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay. But yeah, so Proudhon introduced Marx to political
Yeah, no,
economy.
there is this movement where Marx arrives that political economy, and he says this as much in the preface for one of his books uh, that he owed this to Proudhon, even though he bashed Proudhon ridiculously later
Yeah.
on. But it's funny because the reason why Proudhon saw economy as an important political economy as an important category, or important field for political revolutionary struggles, actually was, I think, more connected to this classical, more liberal approach. The idea that this is a field where you intervene upon, and you need to understand some of its logic to intervene upon it. So you recognize the classic property theft kind of approach, saying labor is expropriated, stolen through property relations. Therefore, we need a theory of property where labor and money are more connected.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an assessment based on political economy and an intervention or an experiment based on it as a response. And I think that Marx, when he went into political economy, he understood that there is something that is neither property nor price. Property relations are connected to, are a condition for value relations, and price is, let's say, small scale contingent realm determined over determined by value, but value is in between the two. Neither the conditioning property relations that concern state and juridical form, nor, let's say, the market, like how the market continues to exist as a place and a certain experience after capitalism. For him, there was something in between the two that needed to be seen and accounted for if any practical uh, agenda is gonna come up. And for example, his whole point was, well, only the abolition of wage labor is gonna alter that underlying invariant domain.
Yeah.
But again, the thing that we were talking about, that there is this kind of mid-scale dimension that is implied in Marx, not really theorized, because it's always the realm of the average, always the realm of, I'm aware that there are fluctuations. Like when he comes to introduce surplus value in chapter 4, he goes through all the other explanation as to why people can exchange, can buy things and resell them for more money, right? For example, being smartasses and kind of uh, just stealing or misleading people, or being smart and just finding specific ways around uh, equivalent exchanges. And he says, all of this exists, but none of this would be possible on average. If everyone was doing this, that explanation wouldn't hold. So you can see that he's always kind of moving up towards the macro scale, towards the totality of capitalism, and so on and so forth. And leaving this kind of low scale thing, smaller scale, as a sort of fluctuation, as a sort of contingent. And of course, it's small contingent things can happen. But that distinction is that I think he brings the analysis to this larger scale, is also something that makes it hard to see what an intervention in the economy would look like from his perspective, right? Because he's already removing himself from that perspective from the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, and that's why every orthodox Marxist intervention happens from state down, right? It's state down because it's always full control of the market, full control of the mode of distribution. It can only be formulated in terms of the macro level.
Yeah, and that's the weird thing, because and the weird thing about it is that for Marx, the large scale is supra-state. So it's even worse than that, because, like, say, in the end of chapter 3, he talks about world money. And the whole point is that money only arrives at its own concept. So money only truly becomes a commodity that's just like any other, but that embodies value as such, when it's money in between states, so outside of the boundary of a territory or a custom or a national sovereign realm. Because, and that's why, after all the complicated, it's like this, within a certain kind of normative space, let's call it a national space where a certain culture is shared, we can agree that the sticks we use to measure length, they no longer really materially relate to their measure, right? So let's say we began with kind of this small branch of a tree that the tree produces, like, due to material reasons, branches that are always the same size, and we use those branches as measure for other things. So we say something is 3 branch long, right? Or the king's feet. The king's feet is like the measure. So everything has 10 feet or whatever. After a while, like, the king can change, and the feet is now smaller. But within that nation, you can still keep the feet as a measure. But now it kind of detached itself from that moment where it was actually based on the actual size, right?
Yeah.
So at first it was just pure relativity, in the sense of we chose something to function as the measure of length, but it was something just like anything else. It wasn't abstract. It was a concrete thing we use as the transcendental, right? A very poor transcendental for measure of everything else.
Yeah.
But, like, the feet can grow. The king is, old. His feet is swollen, or he died, and now there's a new king. Suddenly, you get a bit of an autonomization of that relative measure. It no longer is based on its material. It is based on the material, because the fact that it has some measure still counts, but it doesn't really need to be exactly that size. So now we take another feet and we say, oh, this is the feet, and we still call it a feet, but it's measuring slightly different.
Yeah.
All of those changes rely on some shared level of customs. But when you want to measure something somewhere else, you need to be able to use a length that everyone will accept. So it's only where you're beyond community normative agreements that you truly see that thing functioning as a measure that is not really filled with kind of this in-between commitments to make it sure that it still fits, right? So for a long time, even though we were carrying money in our pockets, like paper money, within national borders, when it came to do like commercial exchange in a large scale between countries, it was again gold.
Yeah.
And gold as the material thing that is embodying abstract social labor time. So it's actually above the state or in between states that you really see money kind of arriving at its notion.
Yeah, but the question I have there is, I mean, we don't have one world money, right? We have exchange rates between currencies.
Yeah, no, that's okay. We're talking about like the idea of world money, and the fact that gold functioned like that for because it had several properties. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, in 1970 or whatever, in this century, last century, for a couple of reasons, right? First, that having to have enough gold to balance out the international exchange market was absurd. Second, that there was already, let's say, it's not that people abolished any sort of standard, is that the standard got relativized. So it's the dollar, but at the same time that the dollar became a better criteria for what is going to be universally accepted, right? Mm-hmm. Beyond borders. You can have moments of scarcity where oil is it's something that fits better those properties. So it's not really that we get like a moment where there is no standard, is that the standard becomes more contingent. Like in this given moment, what is the commodity that will most likely be accepted internationally as this thing that beyond all internal communal state affairs will be accepted by others as the measure of value, right? So you can have dollar, you can have oil, you can have water, you can have the yen.
Yeah.
So politics,
an energy or something in the
yeah,
future.
exactly. So it becomes much more. For example, with oil, in the 1990s or whatever, became like this crucial commodity in the world. But the moment that the whole clean energy movement got more traction and the future value of oil started to be discussed, right? Is it going to be more valuable because it's scarce, or less valuable because the energy matrices of every different country is going to go towards aeolic and nuclear or whatever, and we're not going to want the oil anymore. Suddenly, it's no longer so adequate to function as a kind of this world money.
Yeah.
So, but the idea of world money is still valid. It's valid, right? What is the thing that will function as the measure of abstract wealth when you cannot guarantee all this kind of shelter that state and national identity guarantees within a certain territory? So it's just to say that I'm just mentioning all of this because when you go back to what you said, like that's why Marxists tend to want to intervene in economy at a large scale, meaning the state scale. Other Marxists will criticize them for not being a large scale enough.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a confusing thing because it seems like value is a total property, an invariance that only makes itself seen, only makes itself intelligible when seen from large scale perspectives. But those large scale perspectives, the more it's, I don't know, it's like you can only talk about the heat death of the universe by considering the universe as a whole. But at the same time, the very perspective you're adopting suddenly makes it useless to talk about interventions. Like, okay, but
yeah,
it's precisely the perspective from which you cannot intervene.
Yeah. It's a bit of the problem where you're standing in the space that you're trying to intervene on. You're within the space.
Yeah, it's something like this. So you need to take an outer position, but which is, it does account for interesting properties. It's not a trivial position, right? For example, global crisis of capitalism, they are more intelligible from that perspective that Marx is talking about. But at the same time, that perspective was so impersonal, so kind of removed from national territories, state policies, and so on, that it seems that the very thing that made it intelligible makes it impossible to see intervention points, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the price theory, price approach is, let's say, it makes a lot of analytic phenomena unintelligible and kind of chugs it to, the market is woke up kind of in a bad mood today, kind of it needs to anthropomorphize and scale down large scale phenomena because there's no way to deal with them. But at the same time, it has the benefit of saying, I can do this because at least I have the size for intervention. I'm bringing things to the level of the man on the go, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can think of economic policies and you can think of how to organize your business or whatever to actually have an effect on prices, and then this to some changes.
Yeah, so my impression is that like perhaps the commitment there for the modeling is different in that sense, that Marx wanted, and I think Marx wanted to produce the map of certain traits of a capitalist social formation that you want to be able to learn from our scale, even though learning those things doesn't necessarily give you more potency to act. It just makes you critical of certain approaches, right?
Yeah.
That's why it's critique of political economy. Whereas liberal economics and microeconomics, it's about bringing down to our scale only those properties that seem to be something we can act upon.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's why it seems like it's so effective, but at the same time lacking any explanatory power for large-scale phenomena like crises and so on.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of, and the thing is that it's hard to kind of pitch one thing against the other because it's not really that they're looking at the same thing, right? The problem, I think, is that trying to bind them directly or trying to refute one for the other. The complicated thing there is that, again, it's like trying to dismiss some kind of technological approach to physics due to large-scale cosmological
reasons. Yeah.
Reasons, right? One thing is actually trying to, like, it kind of knows that it's constructing the object, like reducing large-scale economical complexity and properties to a smaller scale because it wants to intervene upon it. So it's more like a technological approach, right? Like, I don't need to solve, let's say, the relation between, like, how quantum mechanics interacts with classical physics on a theoretical level. I need to know the equations so that I can, for example, know how certain engineering situations for the production of, I don't know, using semiconductors and all those electronic stuff, quantum effects will affect larger scale properties of the materials. I need to know how to correct for this, so I don't use up too much material, how I don't waste too much energy or something like this. And for producing doing many stuff, a lot of products with this very unstable materials, you need to think about the interaction of these scales, but you don't need to solve them theoretically. That's a more technological approach. I really don't give a shit about the science. I need the science for utilitarian reasons.
Yeah.
It's different from this approach that says, like, we've made thinkable some large-scale property of a system that supposedly at this large scale could only be explained through theological means. Like, I would even say it's like different fields altogether. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, but anyway, yeah, the point of this whole presentation is to try to create small bridges between them in a way. At least we can draw some nice philosophical insights, maybe. Not necessarily, like you said, actionable items, but okay, so I'll share my screen. Hi, Caron, by the way. Welcome.
Hey.
Let's see. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so I modified the presentation a bit from last time, mainly to kind of take out some of the math elements that I had put in before, because I think I didn't find a good way yet to connect the first part of the presentation to that. I mean, I had some vague ideas about using sheaves and mapping data as a way of constructing like a large-scale view of the economy, which I'm still planning to do, but I think it would be nicer to stick to the notion of value a bit longer. So in this title, value, price, time, and crisis, pretty much will only stick to the first part, value. And the other three, I think it's going to be a bit slower to get to them. But I think that's okay. I think there's a lot more we can extract from the first notion that will help us confront the other three. So I'm going to speed through the parts that we've already discussed. But basically, I'm working based off of a certain thesis that I've been developing through some texts that I've published in Crisis and Critique and other places. But yeah, the basic thesis is that value is an appearance, and then the consequences of that statement, which we can find already in Marx himself, when he discusses, commodity fetishism and this idea that value is spectral in some sense, that it doesn't have a concrete existence, but it can manifest itself in concrete things. But it itself has no real existence per se, or it doesn't. It's not that it doesn't exist. It's an organizing principle, let's say, for things that exist. It's a way of organizing or perceiving things that exist, and then this leads to a way of thinking money and social relationships, which is a unique to capitalism. So then I introduced the Hayekian thesis that prices capture information about the world faster and more accurately than a mind can. And I think this is a really interesting thesis because the thing I like about it is that it isn't necessarily a liberal thesis. It doesn't really have any kind of political consequences on the face of it. Of course, Hayek is definitely against state intervention. He's definitely against state communism of his time, right? And basically, he's kind of a very admired neoliberal thinker. But I think that if we read him closely, we don't need to draw that connection necessarily, because his entire point is that you cannot assume that the market is going to respond well to interventions, right? Like you cannot predict basically what the market will do from outside, and that is because the information you have about the market from outside of it is always going to be poorer, or less of less quality than if you were inside the market via prices, right? And actually, you cannot be inside the market, let's say, yourselves. You can only interface with the inside via these prices. So there's something, basically, the interesting thing about Hayek is that there's something happening in the interaction of prices that's just invisible to us. And I think that thesis, on its own, it isn't neoliberal necessarily, because since we can't predict what the market will do, there's nothing to say that the market in itself is a force of good or a force of like it's always going to be beneficial, whatever the market decides, right? Because we cannot predict it. So the political consequence that you draw, that we should, for example, the neoliberal consequence, which is that we should allow the market to go on as it naturally does, let's say, that political thesis is, you don't have to draw that exactly, because it might, the market may converge to a state which is detrimental for us. So I brought up this Hayekian thing, and I wanted to try to stage this confrontation between the Hayekian thesis and the Marxist thesis to see how, like, where can we find points of intersection or like points of tension, right? The Marxist thesis that there are social relations that are somehow transformed or masked in capitalism, through the form of the commodity. It affects this, it creates this, let's say, large scale appearance of value, which then transfigures these social relationships. So the social relationships, they give rise to value, but then value, once it exists, it changes the very ground upon which it was, upon which it sits, right? Okay, so if I want to stage this confrontation, we have to kind of work through both the different perspectives that liberal economic theory and Marxist economic theory have about a society, right? And about value, right? Value is this thing that actually both sides have a theory about, have a perspective on. So I thought it would be useful to kind of to illustrate both perceptions, and then to see if we can find points of connection. So on the one hand, we have labor time, which for Marx is the kind of the only way that value can be created. And then, of course, we have to go further into that. I'll do that in the future slides. But basically, roughly speaking, the average labor time to produce a commodity, that's the determining factor for value, the magnitude of value, let's say. And on the liberal side, you have supply and demand, right? Because for the liberal economic theory, there really is no distinction between value and price. So from here on out, we can pretty much assume that when we say value, we're saying it's just what price represents, right? And it doesn't really make any sense to talk about a value independent from price, except as maybe like for them, it's like a corner situation where maybe there's like rapid inflation, for example, or something like that, where currency becomes devalued. Then you might see, liberal economic theory may have some way of formulating that difference, but normally price and value are basically the same thing. Then you can see value from the perspective of the total labor power of society. Because for Marx, the only way you can come up with the average labor time is if we view society from above, let's say, from the totality of all the different processes of production that go into making commodities. Then you can figure out, the average labor time. Whereas you do not have that commitment on the side of liberal economic theory, because you don't need to know what everyone's doing. That's actually a nice thing, right? You don't need to know what all of society is doing to come up with a price for something, because you have supply and demand. So you have a way of localizing the calculation, let's say, for value. You can, in a specific community or specific country, you can derive price from the interactions between buyers and sellers without any reference to labor power. So it has a strength there, right? Especially a predictive power, right? Marxist theory has no or almost no predictive power, except on the level of things like crises and, things that actually affect the whole world. Marx has quite a lot of advantage there. But when it comes to the daily fluctuations of value, as we were just discussing with Gabriel, there's no real explanation for the determination of value.
Sorry, I also remember another way that Marx has prediction. That it's interesting because it connects with this, but in a weird way. For example, if you go to, let's say, I think chapter 3 of Capital, you find something like, let me just find it here. He says something like this when he's talking about means of payment and the fact that money, when it's really developed, you no longer needs to settle accounts of debts with commodities, but you can settle accounts with money. So for example, I had a commodity, I sold it for money, now I'm going to use that money to buy a new commodity. But I can have sold my commodity, not paid the guy who I'm supposed to pay, and by owing him, already have the commodity that I need back. So the commodity logic of classical market relations is kind of short circuit. I had commodities and already have the new commodity with me. I just owe somebody money, right? And because, well, this structure where money is now the end in itself, it can be, it's the thing that you're striving to arrive at to pay a debt. He says something like this, is just before the world money section. So the end of the section on means of payment. He says, there's a distinction between paying taxes in natura, he says, like in paying taxes with wealth, right? Actual concrete wealth, and taxes paid with money. And he says, if the exterior commerce imposed to Japan by Europe leads to the transformation of the rent that Europe charges Japan from a natura rent, right? Renting wealth, concrete wealth. So Europe requires rice, requires Japan to pay with whatever commodities it have into monetary rent. So you pay the taxes or the rent, the sort of rent, commercial rent, in terms of money. He says it will be the end of Japan's exemplary agriculture. Its narrow economic conditions of existence will dissolve themselves. So he was making a prediction based on this idea. If Japan starts paying what they owe to Europe, or what Europe kind of charges them through whatever sort of colonial or whatever international commercial relations, if they pay what they owe to Europe in money, they will no longer have to produce things in excess. They can produce them in whatever way they wish, so as long as money is the outcome, right?
Yeah.
So at the moment that this is the way that Japan pays rent to Europe, they will no longer have be required to keep up with an agricultural culture of production. They can do whatever.
I see, yeah.
So you see, it's kind of a prediction, but it's, again, a prediction based on, let's say, the adoption or non-adoption of a social form, and not really a prediction based on, if the price goes up this much, then that much will affect the economy in that way, right?
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, I actually, to modify what I was saying, it's not that it doesn't have predictions. Marxist thinking is full of predictions of that kind, where it is about, the transformation of the social form. The whole all is solid melts into the air, right? I think that's an extension of that idea that there's no, all custom becomes just let's say an artifact of pre-monetary relations.
Exactly. I mean, I was surprised when I read this, because I usually remember Marx saying these things in a kind of unsituated way, right? Capitalism turns everything that's solid into air, or communists will expropriate the expropriators when advanced capitalism comes into contradictions with itself. Like, it's so vague, right?
Yeah.
It's usually not clear that you can actually take these things and, in kind of, rather than in a temporal sense, in a very vague way, you can actually have spatial conditions that make these predictions valuable. So it's not only a matter of advanced capitalism will someday turn into something else. It's also spatially, Europe and Japan are structured in such a way that if the relations become capitalist, no, it's not in the like vague future. It will open up now the space for a certain conversion into Japanese society. So it's also very kind of localized, but it has the same property of being a prediction based on the interaction between total social systems, right?
Yeah.
Kind of classic agriculture based on feudal relations and economic categories of capitalist nature. Like, if you accept to base the relations on abstract wealth, you will open up the space to be kind of absorbed by those relations.
Yeah.
So it's a very specific. I totally agree with you. I just thought this would make it even kind of this reinforces it in a kind of weird way that Marx only makes predictions, let's say, for the future of a social formation or the relation between social formations, not for what happens within one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I think we sometimes take for granted this, but I think it becomes more apparent when we try to jump between the perspective of Marxist critique and this like microeconomic view. I think it's interesting to try to occupy these two different perspectives to see like what one misses in the other. But I think also the thing you were saying earlier that maybe we should just consider them as entirely different fields and not even really looking at the same thing. But then you raise the problem of what is this thing that they're looking at? What are because they seem like they're both looking at society in a particular way.
Yeah, I like the idea of kind of a science versus technology approach, because that kind of maps a difference and a connection, right? Of course, you cannot do like there are no technological advancements that don't really consider state-of-the-art science and what laws of nature we know, but at the same time, there is a very different kind of more pragmatic, localized kind of approach that allows for a lot of kind of free room and leeway and some you can accept some theoretical ignorances, right, from the technological perspective. And
yeah, it's driven by a practical need. Okay, so yeah, basically I'm trying to stage this confrontation between these two different perspectives, let's say the scientific and the technological one, or to at least draw some talk about what is the tissue that connects them. So first, let's review some definitions here for Marx, just so that it'll help us for the later slides. So when we talk about exchange value, we're not yet talking about money. Instead, we are talking about what I can exchange commodity A for, like how much of commodity A and commodity B are exchangeable. So, but not even further than that, if we want to talk about exchange value as such, then we can simply talk about it in terms of the set of commodities that I can exchange for a given commodity, right? Or to be more precise, like the amounts, quantities of other commodities, the set of quantities of other commodities. So what I wrote here is the exchange value is the answer to the question, what can I get in exchange for X? Okay, so it's much larger than the idea of money, which is just a particular commodity. It's just the set of things I can get for something. Use value is the set of ways in which I can use something, right? Again, trying to stay consistent with this set theory idea. So the answer to the question, what can I do with X? Price is the expression of exchange value in terms of one particular commodity, which is money, right? And then Marx draws how this happens, right? From going from simple exchange, relations of exchange to money. That's the journey of the first few chapters, right? Of capital. So once you have price, you can answer the question, how much does X cost? Then value, so this is the cornerstone, right? Value is abstract labor embodied in the commodity, which is verified during exchange. So that's two parts to this definition. What is abstract labor? Abstract labor is what labor becomes under the exchange relation. So it's a bit of a circular definition because you can't have abstract labor until you have exchange. So therefore, abstract labor isn't a concrete labor, right? That's the answer to the question. Okay, well, if labor time determines value, then how come if I spend like twice as much time on something, I don't get twice as much value than the other guy, right? It seems like the stupid question everyone asks when you talk about labor theory of value. Well, Marx's answer to that is that, well, no, because you're comparing your individual labor to the labor time of society as a whole, or the average labor time it requires to make a commodity. So if you spend twice as much time as the average, the second half of that effort is wasted. It doesn't go towards creating more value. You only make as much value as the average labor time is required to make something. But how do you come up with that quantity? Well, you have to determine it through exchange. So that's why it's verified during exchange. So value requires both the sphere of production and the sphere of circulation to make sense of in Marx. You cannot simply calculate value looking at production, and you cannot simply calculate it looking at exchange. And I would say that also liberal economic theory is wholly on the side of exchange, right? In terms of prices and supply and demand, you pretty much only care about the sphere of circulation. And then I wrote that it answers two questions. How can we equate commodity X and commodity Y, which is the substance of value? That's the question of the substance of value. And then how long does it take on average to make X, which is, like I said, the magnitude, the socially necessary labor time. But I think it's also important to keep both in mind, that when we talk about labor time, that's only half of the definition of value. The substance part is also equally important. It has to do with this larger space of social relationships that are required in order for us to equate commodities.
Also, it's very, very interesting that only the two questions at the bottom actually relate to commodities, right? Because the first one is a matter of direct expression. What I can get in exchange for X will give you a set of commodities, right? Other commodities. They are equivalent to X in a certain sense, but they're not implicated in X. Like there are no relations between them. The only relation is this equivalence. What can I do with X also, goes down to sort of modulation of uses that are excluding. One excludes the other, right?
Yeah.
So exchanges, either I can get a certain amount of Y, I can get a certain amount of Z, I can get a certain amount of C. It's one or the other, right? Or some combination of these proportions.
Mm-hmm.
What I can use X is also either as this or as that, and so on.
Right.
How much does it cost? It's also something like this. It's kind of a consolidation of exchange in the sense that it's like how much does X cost means how much of a particular commodity M, money, I can get for X, right? So it's it's kind of a subset of the answer to the question of exchange.
Right. Yeah, it is.
But then the two questions of value, there are questions that like you could reformulate them in terms of finding a relation. Like the answer to those two questions is a relation. How can we equate commodity X and Y is actually a question of what does X and Y have in common, right?
Yeah.
So what is this property P or this element P that X and Y have in common? So it's already a matter of finding something that's connecting X and Y, right? The union point between them, not so much like one or the other. And the question about average of X is actually a question about, I think it could also be reformulated, because the average means that you're equating the labor time of producing many X's, right? So you're actually let's say, comparing X and X line. It's the same question, but not between different commodities, but between the same commodity. Right? How do we equate X and Y is what is common between X and Y.
Mm-hmm.
The question of how long does it take to make X and Y, you're already implying, like, part of the answer is already in the question, but you could have asked it differently. Because if you ask the question, like the substance question, what is common between X and Y? And the magnitude question is, what is common between X and X line?
Right.
And the answer will be, like, the answer to the first will be labor time, to what is in common between X and Y. And the answer to the question X and X line will be a given amount, an average amount of labor time.
I see.
You see my point? Like, because you compared absolutely different things like X and Y, the answer was time.
Mm-hmm.
But in this kind of abstract sense, abstract time, because it's abstract labor.
Yeah.
Right? They're all the product of time spent laboring. And the magnitude question, if you rephrase it to be a bit more impartial, like not already including like you already chosen the way you phrase the question, how long, meaning, right? So that this is a question with temporal, an answer concerning time is already implied in the question.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But you can actually derive that and the average from rephrasing the question. If the question was asked, what is there in common between X and X prime? Meaning a commodity that has the same use value, meaning a commodity that the set of its possible uses is the same, or roughly the same, right? See my point? Like, let me see if I can do this here. So the set of exchange X is like this, right? It has a bunch of other commodities inside of it, like some amount of certain amount of commodity A, certain amount of commodity B.
Are you showing something?
Yeah.
I'm gonna write in the
because you're not, the camera is not open.
I know. I'm gonna write in the chat window.
Okay.
So exchange of X equals some.
Actually, I don't know if it's that great to write in the chat window, because at the YouTube video they don't have access to it.
Okay, so just 1 second.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, it's a good point.
Questão de ordem.
Oh, that's crucial. Just open then here. Here, I also shared my screen now.
Okay.
So exchange of commodity X equals, like, let's say, a certain amount Y of commodity A, a certain amount Z of commodity B, and so on and so forth, right? The use value of X, the way you defined it, like the answer to the question is a set.
Yeah. Yeah. To eat.
Here's the question.
To, I don't know. To consume, different ways of consuming. Yeah.
So the answer will be this, like the use, that it will be this, and I'm not sure how we would phrase this here, but it's a sort of space in which, like, X can be, like, perhaps we could have like a function for which X gives an answer, right? Something like this, like it can has many functions, right? You can use X within, let's say, the function, if it's a pen, the function to write, and it obtains, like, you can click with it, or you put it into the function, use it as a fatal weapon inside an airplane, and, well, you can kill people, like bring an airplane down with it or something.
Yeah.
So it's like a functional approach, right?
Right.
Then the third thing you said was price, and the answer is the exchange value of a particular commodity. So it's a Y value of one commodity, which is money. And now my critique or my suggestion was that when you got to value, you made two questions. You said, how can we equate, right?
Yeah.
X and Y. But I propose that we can rephrase this as saying like, what X and Y have in common. It's easier for us to move to a set theoretic approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because then the value of X is determined by, so X has value and Y has value if we can find something, I don't know how we call this, so abstract labor, why not? Which is both contained in X and Y.
Yeah, it's in the intersection of X and Y.
Yeah, so how do we write this? Like,
just to be clear, Y is the price in money.
no, Y is a commodity. Like, how can we equate commodity? He had it like this: commodity X and commodity Y, right?
It's another commodity. Okay, this is yeah. Okay.
So I'm not sure how I have like, it's not the union. Is like, how do I write the intersection? Is the union in inverse, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Upside
I don't have it here. Okay.
Yeah, I don't have it here. Something like this. That's the first question, which you call the substance question, right?
Yeah.
And the second question is the magnitude. And I realize that you can ask that question in the same way, exact the same question, but you just ask what X and X prime have in common. And then you say, why can I call, like, why is X prime different from Y? That's the question.
Why X prime is the total amount of X produced.
No, my point is X prime. That's why I wanted to write the formulas. X prime, like a commodity, let's say a commodity Z equals X prime if the set UX, right, the set UZ is equivalent to the set UX.
Mm-hmm.
My point, if the functions that you can, the use values of a commodity are the same as the others, then we can say that it's just an iteration of the same product. Because we define here, it's something that has all the same functions.
Okay, yeah.
So now we have formally defined why this question is different from this question. Because otherwise it's hard to ask the question, because the way you formulated the question that I didn't like very much, right, which is how long does it take on average to produce X?
Mm-hmm.
It has this long here and this average here.
Yeah.
Perhaps we don't want this to be presupposed. We want to arrive at the fact that it's average time. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So this version of the question, what does X and X line, meaning another commodity that's just like X, have in common? It will give us as an answer the intersection between X and X line. Right?
Yeah, what you're saying is use?
No, but that's not what they have in terms of exchange. So I added this as a way to define two iterations of the same commodity. So why are we allowed to consider both commodities as being the same? If a commodity will be said to be an iteration if its use set equals the set of the commodity we're comparing it to.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So now that this use set is defined as the same, the question of what they have in common in terms of value or the determining factor that they have in common will fall on only have to, that's what I wanted to get at. Like the complicated part for me is that how do we get socially necessary labor time as an answer rather than a presupposition?
Okay, I see.
So my point is we need it appears when we compare not two commodities, what they have in common. This is easy because they're so distinct from each other. that the only thing they have in common is being the product of labor. So we arrive at labor, the substance of value, as being labor because we cannot find any other answer. But that time is the magnitude of how much, is the magnitude that measures, right, how much this will be valued at. It's something that we don't want to presuppose. We want to arrive at why is it time and not something else, right?
Yeah, and actually, you could not arrive at that average just by comparing x and x prime, but you would actually need to compare x prime, x double prime, x triple prime.
Yeah, exactly. So any commodity Z that fits this schema will be within the set of commodities we're comparing.
Yeah.
So that's why I wanted to have this as a middle step, because now we know what commodities are included in what we call this average. Like what are the commodity productions that we are considering?
Mm-hmm.
We're considering these ones, the ones that fall into this, right? And now within this, we need to find a way to ask the question so that time is the answer.
Yeah. You could define a set where basically an equivalence relation.
Yeah, because here is this is clearer because we're, let's say, more clearly at the level of exchange, right?
Mm-hmm.
The value of one and the value of the other can be exchanged because there is some point that we can compare them.
Mm-hmm.
And which is abstract labor.
I'm having hard time understanding where does X line come from, because it seems that the question presupposes the definition the definition you give, because X line is nowhere to be seen before the question is asked, and then is defined by the answer. The answer defines X line.
No. I'm defining X line based on something we already had.
Where is it?
Yeah, because any commodity, so Z is a commodity we don't know what it is. It's a new commodity.
Okay.
Whatever commodity will be X line if the use set of that commodity is equal to the use set of our current commodity X.
Okay, but the order of exposition seems to be reversed. I think we need this definition before we can ask the question what X and X line have in common.
Yeah, but that's why I have here as a necessary step.
Okay, I see why it is a necessary step, but I think the order of explanation is kind of reversed again.
Yeah, we can then say here, just add here, we have exchange, we have use, we can say
something like that. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, but X, we can say that X, we have a commodity X.
You have a commodity Z, just like you.
How do we know something is the same commodity? We know that Z equals commodity X if this.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
And then excellent.
Yeah, so I don't need to have this here because we already know what it means.
So you already have the answer to the second question, actually.
Yeah, but
it is a condition to have. It's a condition. It's not really an answer. It's a condition of identification between two commodities.
Yeah, so I would put it like this: like the value of X and the value of Y, they have in common the fact that that's called labor, right? L goes into X.
Yep.
And L goes into Y. We call abstract labor. Now the question is how much of this goes, right? That's what we want to show that, well, because now it's not the fact that labor goes into X and labor goes into X of Y is not that's not the determination we're looking for.
That doesn't make Y an X line. That's the thing, right?
Yeah, because now we want to know that
Y is not an X line just because we have the same abstract labor going into it. So you have a supplementary condition that's the one which was written before.
Yeah, because that's what I wanted to get at. It's like what they have in common is the labor that goes into making U of X.
Yeah.
Right, the labor that goes into making the actual commodities. So at stake in the U. So, but it's the average of this.
Okay.
Right, so the value of X is the second determination, right? The value of X is determined by some average here. I don't know how to have an average. But the total, right?
Mm-hmm.
Labor that goes into making the use value of X.
Okay.
But because it's total, it's, or better, we could say like it's this average.
Total average.
Of the labor on U of X, U of X, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think the slight confusion here would be when we say in common in a set theory use of that term, that's strictly the elements of the set.
Yeah.
But in the way you defined it, you're saying that the two commodities are the same if they have the same use set. So strictly speaking, in common means, well, these two things have in common the same elements. Ways of
the word here. Yeah, I just wanted to find a way to like reduce those two questions, which I think they are already full of. They're already very charged, you know. Reduce them to something. But I agree, it might be too much, like because the question of magnitude is not what they have in common, right? Is how would we?
It's a different thing. It's
yeah, because it's a question on you're asking two questions. Like one is of substance, and in common very much defines substance, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Magnitude is not how much of something, right?
Yeah.
So it makes sense that it's the second question, right? How much of L?
Yeah, I think that makes it clearer. Yeah.
Yeah, because you define L in the previous.
Yeah, how much of Lx?
Yeah. Otherwise, the idea of magnitude is not present either.
Yeah, exactly. It's true. Yeah. So we do need to have the word in common here, and we do need to have something which is a question of quantity here, right? So I can erase this one here.
Yeah, no, that makes more sense. Let's see.
Yeah, but then this is this. I'm not sure if this is a good way to approach it, right?
Yeah, see, that's the crazy part is you need, as soon as you go into the question of magnitude, you already have to talk about the set of all x's, x prime, and so on, to say how much do they have in common, right? It's not so much given any two x, how much they have in common. It's how much does one x have in common with all the other x's.
Exactly. It's a total. That's what I wanted to get at. Like these two questions, they put in relation, right? X and Y. Like the first questions you had, they didn't require this. I'm just in my screen share here. Just so that we don't get lost too much, we can continue. But I just wanted to get at this point that I think that it's unclear from the way you wrote the questions. That the second question is equally a question about the relation between commodities, and not a question about one commodity, you know?
Yeah.
And the way that you phrase the question, it seems like time and average were already presupposed, but they're actually the only possible answer.
Right.
Looked like time was the only possible answer to the substance question, right?
Hmm.
Because it's true, if you ask the question of only X and Y being any given X and Y, like what does, I don't know, Lucky Strike cigarettes and some other cigarette or some beverage have in common, you can find other things. But when you realize that you need to be able to ask this question of any commodity,
right,
you will arrive necessarily at the fact that they were mediated by labor. Like, it's not a normative kind of, things we will only value those things that have labor. Is that try to go any other way through them without the mediation of some human action, right?
Yeah.
Itself can only be measured by expenditure of time somehow.
Yeah.
And then the magnitude one also is, that's why I also always had a problem with this idea of how long it takes to produce something, because implicit in that question is actually a question of reproduction of commodities. Like, to ask the question of how long it takes to make X, you're actually asking the question of how long it takes to reproduce X, because you're already presupposing the set of all productions of X.
Yeah.
There cannot be just one X, right? That's why we get into trouble when it comes to ideas and artworks and things that have no X line, right? Like, an idea is defined by the fact that it will not have the same function as any other idea. And an artwork is supposed not to be equal to anything else. In those moments, it's hard to tell what the cost of, like, the magnitude of value.
Yeah.
Because reproduction cost falls to an absolute.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. So I think actually the question of substance then has to be, I mean, that's where we have to be very careful, or the passage from substance to magnitude.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, I've been reading The Science of Logic again, in the passage where Hegel is talking about the move from quality and quantity to measure and magnitude. And of course, it's never a matter of averages. There are no averages in the mind of God, but especially because it's so absolute, it's also interesting how it's always a matter of becoming indeterminate to some determination. Like, you need to become indifferent to some difference in order to construct a question to which the answer is just the amount of something.
Right.
So I don't know. Yeah, just so I don't want to get lost in crazy stuff, but
yeah, but I do think I need to change that point at some point. Yeah. How long does it take? Yeah, it would have to be more like exactly as you wrote it, how can we compare commodity to the set of all of the same commodity or something?
Yeah,
like that.
I think it's something like, because then it makes sense that what you will find inside of all of them is that some labor in the form of wage labor, but not necessarily, some labor was spent in making them, right?
Yeah.
You will, and you want to, and let's say if the first question, the answer is there is a subset labor in all commodities, like in their composition, right? The second question is how much, what's the average of the quantity of these sets in those commodities, right?
Okay, so just to continue, so yeah, the last point is capital. Okay, so capital is value, which is aimed at producing more value. And of course, there's a lot of steps in between with Marx's analysis of the passage from, regular value. You have CMC, right, to the equation of capital, which is MCM, money, commodity, money, which then can be further elaborated. But yeah, but I just wanted to give these simple definitions so that we can compare them later on. So the interesting part of value is that Marx calls it spectral objectivity. So it has a weird status in his work. He doesn't really focus on value. He always talks about exchange value, use value, and so on. And then he immediately goes to things like talking about the law of value. But value as such doesn't seem to, it has this like very in-between status. It's something that only kind of appears in the margin of his analysis. It's never like the central focus. Although it's like, it's central in the sense that it's informing all the other definitions that he gives. But really, whenever he talks about concrete commodities, he's talking about use values, and then he's talking about how those use values enter the sphere of circulation and become exchangeable. And so I say here that value cannot directly appear; it must be embodied by a commodity for another commodity. And that's another thing. Value is a relation that it only becomes visible when you have two commodities together, one commodity which represents or embodies the value of another commodity. And which is why we had that trouble with the last slide about equating commodities, right? Because the substance that is in common to them can only appear when you put them together. Okay, so therefore it requires both production and exchange to appear. You have to obviously produce the commodity itself, but then you have to exchange them or put them together in some way, in some kind of relation, in order for value to appear. And the crazy part, which is the later points we'll talk about, but once you exchange them, you also learn something new about production. It's not simply that in production you have some indeterminate items and they don't really have any value, and then you put them in exchange and they have value. No, because you exchange them, they always had value. The value existed during production. They were created in production, but they didn't become, let's say, actualized or made detectable until you exchange them. So it's this it has this very spectral status, right? It's like a ghostly thing that was always there from the beginning, but only appears once you exchange. So yeah, and then we have it is both a magnitude and a relation, right? And I think the passage from one to the other, that is where we have a lot of problems, because if we stick to the definition of magnitude, then a liberal economic theory can just say, well, why do we need to stick to time when you can just time is isomorphic in some sense. The clock time is isomorphic to payment, to price, right? As soon as we agree to the definition of value as labor time, then anyone can come along and say, well, if you want to be fair about it, then we just have to pay the fair amount per hour of a labor consumed, right? Labor spent. But Marx's whole point is that there is something lost in between the two, right? Between the definition of social substance to the definition of labor time, average labor time, there's something lost or something not quite equal. Okay, so that's where we get into the question of labor. You have concrete versus abstract labor. So concrete is when obviously a physical thing is made or something is done by somebody. But then you have abstract labor, which is something that only appears again through exchange, where by exchanging two things, we are making a statement about how much, how to compare the labor that went into making those two things. So if commodity A is compared to commodity B, or exchange for commodity B, we are making a value statement about the labor that it took to make commodity A and the labor that went into making commodity B. So the next point says, okay, labor produces value, and the use value of labor is to make value. So again, in the previous definition, remember, use value is a set of ways in which I can use a commodity. So in that set of ways of using labor, it's to make value, right? Some type of value, a specific output. But labor itself also possesses a value, which is roughly, if we speak on the terms of magnitude, it's the time cost to produce or reproduce a type of labor. So this distinction is where we have the distinction between use and exchange as applied to labor, right? You have the use value of labor, which is to make value, but you also have the exchange value of labor, which is determined by how much it costs to hire a laborer, but also to sustain the laborer so that they can come back and continue to work. And then labor has a price which is determined by its value and not by its use value. So basically when you exchange labor on the market, you're not really pricing it by its use value, because, as the argument goes, you don't know yet what the use value. You know what the use value is, but you don't know what the exchange value of the product produced will be. So, the logic of exchanging money for labor goes. It depends upon, or normally depends upon, this cost to produce the type of labor, which is why it also drops as technology improves. As technology improves, basically you don't need as much of that labor time to produce your commodities. So you can always see a kind of a expansion of value at the same time that you see a decrease in the cost of labor. So how do I say this? Like the use value of labor seems to always be increasing, whereas the exchange value of labor always decreases. They seem to be inverses of each other, because insofar as labor produces more use values, other commodities, those in turn make it cheaper to have more labor. It makes it cheaper to maintain labor, right? So this is
the reason why I was kind of struggling with the magnitude question, and I mentioned that we should find a way to phrase it so that that whole thing about how much of this common property, how much of this substance do X and X line have in common, right? Because, and I said that this presupposes the set of all, like this average time of production, is that when we get to labor, exactly what you're saying about the value of labor, right? Magnitude of value of labor. We need to have that question very much figured out, because this effect that you're mentioning, the sort of dissociation between the reproduction cost of labor and the set of uses that labor can have, right? Yeah. That's where it should be clear, like that the use value of labor concerns like an infinite set of functions that labor can obtain. Amongst them is the production of commodities A, B, C, D in a given quantity, right?
Yeah.
They should be dissociated from the exchange or the price of labor, right? Which is first from the exchange value of labor, which is a set of commodities.
Yeah.
Like the moment that we understand exactly how we want to write this magnitude question, it should become clear that the value of labor the magnitude of value of labor is based on the average cost of socially reproducing labor.
Mm-hmm.
Not on the use function of that labor.
Yeah.
Right? This is the dissociation that you're talking about right now, right? I can plot, once I buy labor and use it, the set of, like this infinite set of functions that labor can have include, for example, new things that through productivity, I can, through transformations, technological transformations, can make me extract much more use out of that labor. Whereas the value of that labor is not conditioned by this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's conditioned by the reproduction cost.
Yeah.
But we want to arrive at this problem of labor as sort of paradox of disjunction from the previous definitions. Like it should follow naturally from them, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why I think that the question it's the question of magnitude needs to be rephrased as the relation between x and x line, because the question of labor, the value of labor is precisely the magnitude of value of labor is defining those terms. Like it doesn't really concern how much the time that you would spend to reproduce your labor, but the time that's averagely spent.
Yeah. The confusing point here is that it's kind of like a second order question, because we already said that what commodities have in common is labor. So if labor is considered as a commodity, then what do two different types of labor have in common? Well, it's kind of one way of addressing that is by saying that they have labor in common. That what is in common between two different types of labor is also labor.
Yeah, but I think that's where the difference between labor and labor time is important, because the fact that you spend some time is already distinguished from, let's say, the distinction between the being of something, right, and some more accidental quality that, you know, you can swim, but how long did you spend swimming? It's not really a question of like the substance in that sense, right? Time is, let's say, it's supposed in this whole construction as a more verifiable exterior way of checking something about labor. So the fact that labor is connected to time in this inverse way, right? Not so much, you have, let's say, labor time appearing as category, and then that category appears as, let's say, the time we put when we labor, and which will concern the magnitude of all commodities, right?
Mm-hmm.
The average of this. And then there's the question of the time we need to produce labor, to produce that first time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but then it's not necessarily that this is not a question about production, it's a question about consumption, right?
Uh-huh.
So in the first question, let's say the production question, the time we put when we labor is it's a question of production. So the time employed in production by labor. And the second is a question of consumption. The time, let's say the consumption, right, that replenishes that labor.
Yeah.
That distinction is something I don't think we managed to kind of, it should be already at stake in the previous questions, right? But it's not clear there yet.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So labor produces a value and it's consumed that way. So you're saying it's a question of consumption because we're talking about how do we consume labor? We consume it to labor use value. But if labor possesses a value, then that's a question of exchange. Sorry, no, that's a question of production, you said.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to get my head around how I would formalize this, because when you consume labor, meaning the use of labor, right? Consuming labor means producing new value. Mm-hmm. The use of labor is possibly, not necessarily, if you don't know how to use labor, it won't be the case. Like you can hire a bunch of workers and they just sit around the whole day, nothing was produced. But they could produce use values that are not labor itself.
Yes.
So the use of labor is also the production of some commodity X, which has its own set of uses, right? That were not included in the use value of labor itself.
Yeah, the interesting thing is not only can labor produce commodities that are not labor, but that labor can produce labor, right?
Yeah, but that's where it gets complicated, because labor cannot produce labor. Like, nothing produces labor in the sense that we produce a commodity. We can reproduce the already existing labor, right? The whole question of feminism and reproduction theory is based on this fact. Like, look, guys, nobody like Marx already put in these terms, like land. Nobody produces land. Like, it's here, right? It concerns nature in a certain sense. Nobody produces labor, and nobody produces money in that simple sense of, hey, I just invented, a symbolic system. Like,
yeah,
those three things go through some level of autonomy that you need to appropriate yourself of them, but you can't really create them in the same sense that you create some new commodity. So you can get the reproduction cost of labor, but you cannot get the production cost in the same sense.
Okay, I see.
So it seems to me like use labor, within the use set of labor, is the production of the use set of something else. Right? It's like when you buy labor, you can consume it in such a way that it produces things that are not itself. Whereas if you buy a machine without labor, you can't get it to produce something that was not already known to be within its use set somehow. And then the question is, okay, but the exchange of labor, right? Where will the magnitude of that exchange, the Y of A, the Z of B, or ultimately the Y of dollars or money, right? So the price, where will the price of labor come from? Well, it will come from the fact that you can buy with it the things that have the same amount of labor in them as what it costs to buy that labor, right? No, as what it costs to reproduce that labor.
Yeah.
Like, I just want to clarify the answers to our questions of exchange, use. What is the reproduction of like, what do we mean by same commodity, and what do we mean by price, and what do we mean by substance and magnitude, which were the questions we were talking about before, right. So that they're clear enough so that when we arrive at the paradox of labor, we can derive the paradox from them. Because it seems to me like, just to go back to that screen I was sharing with you guys first, right? It seems to me that we want to somehow have these questions clear enough that when we arrive at the use of labor, big L, this set, right, includes something like the use set, the use value of other things, right? Like the use of X. There are functions, ways to put labor to work that give out like some other commodity, right? And at the same time, we want to know that the price of L is determined somehow, like the magnitude of because the price is the magnitude in money terms, right? It is the answer to the question of how much of, and that's where we get complicated, how much of L in the sense of this. This is the thing. I think here is how much of labor went into L and L line, right? I'm going to call it A just to make it easier here. how much of A for abstract, right?
Yeah.
I think this should be clear enough that how much goes into it. Well, so the value of labor will be defined in terms of an average. That's where this answer here is not good enough, because we cannot apply it here to labor. And we should be able to, because the answer here, like in non-formal terms, should be the value of labor is determined by the cost to reproduce by the average cost to labor force, right?
Mm-hmm.
The average here concerns the fact that the relation between L and L line. But this cost to reproduce is not based on use. It's based on exchange. Like how many commodities you need to buy, right? This reproduce labor force. Mm-hmm. That's the twist here. We need to, because it needs to be a formalism that applies both to any other commodity and to labor.
Yeah, but we haven't really introduced the distinction between production and reproduction here. Like,
no, that's my point. That's the whole point of the question of magnitude being reformulated, because the comparison between X and X line rather than X and Y is a question of reproduction.
Ah, okay.
That's why I wanted to show it that, say, the average of X and X line and X double line and so on and so forth, because it's a matter of iteration. It's a matter of something and something that has the same use as it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, but the question of reproduction of labor force is again that question. The question of, like, I don't care how much you need to survive. I care how much is needed, how much I would pay to anyone else to be in your place doing your job.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of reproduction. Like, it's exactly, it needs to be clear that this question of the price of labor is actually answered in the same way that we would answer the question of the magnitude for any other commodity. That's the whole point, right?
Right. So it's not only labor, but any commodity whatsoever. Its magnitude of value is determined by its reproduction.
Yeah, that's why, I mean, I think that the reproduction theory is showing that when you bring this commodity, this principle of commodity back to labor commodity, you find out that it's irreducible to a set of commodities. It includes, for example, feminine, housework, and things like this. But the whole point is that it's the same question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say wages are set. Wages are defined in this way, like the wage, which is the price of L, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's somehow defined by the set A of Y of A, B of Z of B, which is the exchange, right? Which is equal to a particular amount of money, so X of money, which must be equal somehow, right, to what you need in terms of these commodities here to replenish the labor you spent.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually called minimum wage, because it's not the case for all wages, but again, the underlying variance of the wage, the price of labor, equals the set of commodities which, expressed in terms of money, are equivalent to the answer to this question. That which the expenditure of your labor and somebody else spending the same labor would need.
Right. Some people need more, some people need less to reproduce their labor. But by comparing them, you get this.
Yeah, but for example, if most people who work in factories found a way to live in a slum, a favela, where the living costs are supposedly low, they will need less money. They will drive the price down. They're not buying land. They don't need it to. They are building their own houses, things like this. So a wage laborer who cannot compete with them if he has his own house or pays rent or something like this.
Yeah.
Because the set of commodities that he needs to reproduce is kind of off the average.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, the average is moving, and each individual laborer has to adjust themselves to that.
Yeah. So I mean, the question is, I think that the whole point for Marx was to show that this issue here is not based on a break with the law of value, but actually with its implementation for labor.
Yeah.
So the answer to the question of magnitude and substance needs to be coherent with that answer when we come to labor. So why do I think this is something to think about? Because at the level of value, the value of other commodities, we never see the short circuit between what a commodity can be used for and what its value is. Mm-hmm. Because the two things happen at separate points: consumption and production, right? Exchange and use. But with labor, they happen at the same place, because you use it to produce commodities. So you use it before exchange, not after. So the answer to this here is a set like it's the use, like this set here of what you can exchange, what you have in exchange for your labor must be equated with something at the level of use of labor, I think. Right? It's a short circuit between how much you are valued and the actual use of money. I don't know. You see my point? Like, it's complicated in that sense.
Yeah. Well, basically what you're saying, you're trying to make this paradox of labor, the value versus the use value paradox, you're trying to make it consistent with any other commodity.
Yeah, because I think that's the premise of, if you want to formalize Marx's theory of value, it needs to follow that, right?
Yeah.
Because we want to see, I think what we're striving at is to find, like, there are two ways of approaching this. I think one is the paradox in a kind of contradiction sense of, you see, so though I'm paid in let's say, money, labor is not produced by labor. So how can I be applying the law of the products of labor to labor itself? Mm-hmm. Then you criticize Marx for saying, we criticize capitalism for being incoherent, right? Mm-hmm. You're applying a function or applying something that is only properly applicable to the products of labor. You're applying it to labor. But that's not what Marx is saying, because this is, for Marx, not the contradiction of capitalism. This is the condition for capitalism. The difference between between markets and capitalism is that the things that produce commodities are themselves commodified: land, labor, and money. Mm-hmm. So this cannot be the short circuit that appears at the level of surplus value and so on, because this is a condition, not the problem. So that labor is a commodity, that's not let's say the twist we want to introduce. What we need to criticize is that surplus value is an effect of the coherence of the law of value being including these things, right?
Yeah. I see what you mean. Surplus value is not an exception to the logic of value.
Exactly. It's not
consequence of the totalization of the logic of value.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we need to be able to ask the question of how much of abstract labor do X and X line have in common? And we say, well, it takes some time to produce them, right? That question needs to be the same question that we ask of the magnitude of value that is at stake in the value of labor. Well, is that it takes some time to reproduce labor. Okay, but how do we know how do we measure that time? We don't measure it in terms of labor, we measure it in terms of other commodities. Right? The set of commodities that you need to use to reproduce yourself.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to write that down, but that's the point, I think.
Yeah. Well, I can make a note to write that. But yeah, the set of, let's see, the set of commodities required to make up like an X prime or L prime, right?
Yeah.
But again, within that set of commodities required for reproduction of L prime, you find some L, another L, right? That's the whole example of housework, for example.
Yeah, I think that's the point. Like their critique is based on this. Look, the moment you look at this set, it will include things that, like, it will exclude things that it needs, right? Because they're not, if they were to be commodified, the money would go up, right? So just as popular housing build, like self-construction in the slums, is something that is being removed from value, so that the value goes down, right? The minimum wage goes down, so that I can actually live off of it, right?
Yeah.
Like with, I don't know, minimum wage in Brazil, you cannot pay rent. So you need to move to a place where you can build your own house.
Yeah.
The minimum wage in Brazil, you can also not pay for a nanny. So you oppress women so that they stay with the babies. So this is why it's abstract labor, not concrete labor. This set will not include all actual activity. It will only include activities that were commodified. Because if they were to include all activities and they were all to be considered commodified, the price would go up.
Yeah.
So it's not the set of concrete activities or of everything you need, or even the set of commodities required in the absolute sense, right? That's why it's L line is the average again. Because it excludes a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. Well, when we say set of commodities, we exclude things which are needed but are not themselves commodities. Right?
Yes, exactly. So again, and you see, it always comes down to land, labor, which is now feminine labor, housing, right?
Right. Yeah.
So on the side of the laborer, his reliance on things which are not the products of labor, which are family, land, and so on. That's a nice way of putting it, right? One of the consequences of commodification of land and labor for the capitalist so to treat them as properties, is that on the side of the laborer, because those things are still conditioning of their laboring capacity, they become invisible, right?
Mhm.
So, but just to clarify, so the problem that I see here that we don't know how to answer yet is that when we first spoke about magnitude, it seemed like it was an average amount of abstract labor. Sorry, no, not abstract labor, right? An average amount of labor, and it actually gives us abstract labor, right?
Yeah.
So concrete labor then.
Right. Yeah. Because we.
I think that's where the problem comes in, because the question of, when we ask the question of substance, the answer is abstract labor.
Yeah.
But the question of magnitude does touch on concrete, because concrete time, the average of concrete time, is socially necessary time. It's not abstract time, abstract labor in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the answer to the magnitude question is the particular value of x equals the value of x line, x prime, insofar as the concrete labor, not the abstract, so concrete, so put C, right? The concrete labor that goes into making this set here of use values, right? The average of it.
Mm-hmm.
Of C of ux and ux prime and so on, right?
Yeah. Could you send this to me after the presentation so I don't have to?
No, of course, of course. So just because if we start writing it in these terms, when we get to the minimum wage, like this set of commodities here is defined by their concrete use, right? Mm-hmm. What do you need to reproduce yourself?
So in the question of magnitude, you said how much of A do x and x prime have in common? But do you mean C?
Now I mean C, right? How much? Okay, we know that labor is what they have in common. So now let's ask the question: how much labor? But how much is no longer a question of. It's a question of quantity. So concerns determination and not indetermination, right? Like abstract labor is labor indeterminately considered.
Yeah, but couldn't we just say that average of C is A?
Yeah, but why does Marx use a difference between abstract labor and socially necessary labor time?
Yeah, I thought one was the substance, another one was the magnitude of the same thing.
But when you measure socially necessary labor time, you don't measure it. You measure it concretely, right?
Yeah. Okay.
That's where I think the whole problem comes in. Like the abstract labor seems to be the answer to the question when I'm looking at the level of, let's say, production only appears as a sort of phantasm for circulation. I have two commodities, and I ask what they have in common, and I'm like, it's the referent of a question asked of circulation.
Mm-hmm.
Look, man, I have the cigarettes and the coffee here. Like, what do they have in common? Well, abstract labor. But now I have the cigarette, and I want to know why. Why is it equivalent to a specifically amount of Y, right? Why is it X of like $5 of cigarettes to $5 of cigarettes is like a $1, and $5 worth of coffee is not even this or that much, right? Mm-hmm. Then the question is, well, but how much? It concerns how much time it goes into making each of them. Mm. This question of how much time is a question that has more determinations for labor than just the fact of labor, right? So the magnitude is like we're moving out of production towards this average, so from concrete labor up to some abstract average, and the question of substance is like we're moving down from an average to something more concrete.
Mm.
I don't know, like, see my point? Like,
yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, yeah, I think also it's confusing. Like, no one ever does this calculation of average of C, really. It's not, it's pretty simple.
We do make it. It's made when you go to exchange and you find out that you're spending way too much on making something.
Yeah.
Like Marx says this on chapter 2 or 3, I don't remember now. He says, look, you come to, these things are made equivalent, or they are, these magnitudes, they kind of get into some equilibrium because, you kind of anticipate it in production. Mm-hmm. Hey man, don't spend so long in making that little, I don't know, glass of this coffee cup. You should be quicker in making it, and you make it quicker. Then you come to the market and you find out that, you still had to pay the guy for 3 hours worth of work, and that made it more expensive when you compare it to other. So you come back to production and say it needs to be even quicker, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm trying to find here where he says this, but
yeah, but that's still yeah, I guess I see what you mean. That's still C though. Like you find out that, well, I don't know, maybe you find some measure of the average of C as well, because when we say average of C, we mean across all of society, right?
Yeah, that's why it's socially necessary. Like it's a broad total concept, but it's a concrete totality made of the interaction between commodities. Whereas abstract labor is not a concrete totality. It's let's say it's an invariance.
Yeah.
It's not built up from the parts, right?
Yeah. Earlier you said something about swimming versus the time you swam or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, like you have a swimming team for Olympics. You can say, what does these guys have in common? Well, they're all swimmers. Okay, but why is that guy the first in line and that guy is sitting on the bench? That concerns something specific. Like it's a different question that gets a different answer based on some evaluation of the specific performances, right?
Right. Okay. No, that's pretty clear now.
So I think that the distinction between concrete and abstract labor, I mean, just thinking about the structure of the chapters, like it goes from use and exchange value to concrete and abstract labor. And the interplay between the two remains always important, because the expenditure of concrete labor will determine how many commodities I need to reproduce myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I will be paid that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. Like, I just think that this is where we need to.
Yeah, there's also more steps there. I mean, the question of how productive your labor is still, like, that's more on the side of relative surplus, right? That's really what determines you going back to your workers to say, oh, you guys need to work faster, whatever.
Yeah, if you say you need to work longer, it's absolute. But if you need to work faster, like more intensively, right?
Yeah.
But still, like what I think, it's just good not to. I mean, the whole reason why I'm babbling about this and not just simply letting you to continue is that it does seem like it's important not to lose track of the fact that we're like, there's these two interpretations of this. Like, when you include the labor commodity into the logic that you were constructing before, you can either produce a short circuit in the sense that it's a contradiction, or you can produce a dissociation, which I think is the point, right?
Yeah.
The aspect of this logic that will determine how much it costs, how much you owe the laborer, has nothing to do, is dissociated, at least directly, from what you can use his labor for, how you consume it, right?
Mm.
So we need to be able to construct these rules before, so that this fact becomes clear, that the reproduction cost of labor is dissociated from how much it can be. So the value of labor as a production capacity is dissociated from what you use that capacity for.
Yeah, I think we achieved that with the idea of reproductive cost or reproduction cost.
Yeah, but I just don't know how to write it down. But still, yeah.
Yeah, not completely formal, yeah. But
Sure.
okay, so yeah, I mean that's the last point. Then the fact that use value and value for labor diverge is what allows for the existence of surplus value. But if to be careful there, it's not a contradiction, but again, it's just an extension of value, right? Just more value encompassing labor. Okay, so now I have a quote here that so again, what I said earlier is that value has a spectral status. It's not it doesn't come into complete focus in Marx. It really informs the rest of his analysis. And he says as much in this quote, where he says, value, therefore, does not stalk about with a label describing what it is. It is value, rather, that converts every product into a social hieroglyphic. Later on, we try to decipher the hieroglyphic to get behind the secret of our own social products. For to stamp an object of utility as a value is just as much a social product as language. So I think, yeah, exactly this. Why are we going through all these steps very carefully to derive these contradictions or derive the definitions that Marx has put forward? We have to do those steps carefully because it's a hieroglyphic. Because these things are, say, they're now encoded in some way. They don't simply appear anymore. The value doesn't just simply appear. It's something that has to be deciphered within the products. So, okay, now we're moving towards the Badiou part of the presentation because, okay, what is this way of encrypting or decrypting commodities? Why does the fetishism of commodities seems almost like, on the one hand, you have like a psychological component, right? It's very easy to say, okay, fetishism of the commodity means we're confused or we're deluded about the commodity. So that's one part of the problem. The other part is like, what does it mean to have this form of social hieroglyphic? Like, what is a social hieroglyphic that's not a delusion? How do we talk about these kinds of entities? So I think this is the direction that we should follow to get to Badiou. But here in this slide, I talk about, okay, value as the mode of appearance of social relationships in capitalism. But the question, so the way Marx puts it forward, labor is not directly social. Labor is private, of private individuals. They only become social in the act of exchange. So this is why I wrote here that value is the mode of appearance of social relationships, because you don't see social relationships other than through exchange. Okay, so that's a key point, that things remain private during production. Only during exchange does the social character of labor appear. So yeah, value is inherently bipartite. It is both exchange and production, but only the former expresses social relationships. Right. During production, laborers still relate to each other as commodified labor power. or labor and, let's say, those who buy labor. But you can also say between individual laborers. I was thinking about this, how, you know, even with, let's say, your coworkers in a work situation, there is always still a sense that you can be exchanged, right? I mean, the one person is replaced by another. If someone gets fired, you'll have a replacement, and you even refer to it as a human resource in the sense of, but maybe this is already too much like a psychological thing. But I just wanted to comment that this fact of labor power being private has a palpable dimension to it. It's not simply, you know, Marx being cryptic. And social relationships are, the way I put it is, they're encrypted during production and decrypted during exchange. So the fact that we can decipher the social hieroglyphic means that at some point they must have been encrypted, right? But the paradox of it is that there was never a moment where you could like catch the production process and be like, this is where you're hiding the social relationships. I think that's where we get a lot of problems when we talk about alternate forms of organization, where the idea is we can organize ourselves in such a way within capitalism such that our social relationships will become more visible or more authentic. Like, I no longer relate to you as just another labor power, but like commodified labor power, but instead I relate to you as another person. We're people working together. We're friends, teammates, family, or something like that, right? But all of those things are assuming that it's a contingent effect, but instead Marx is saying that no, it's necessary that social relationships are never visible in production, only through exchange. So I think that there's some point there to make about alternate forms of organization.
Mm-hmm.
And then under the exchange relation, okay, so we have relationships between people are opaque, relations of domination are impersonal. In another way of saying that is labor is always fully compensated, so it's never personal that you're being dominated by your employer, right? They paid you, it's fair. If you do feel dominated, it's always you should direct your anger towards, I don't know, some abstract thing like the system or something like that. But you can never say you don't like a employee does not in general direct their anger towards their employer. In fact, you're usually grateful that your employer is keeping you there. Money becomes a productive force in itself, right? And then spontaneous consciousness takes value as objective. Okay. So this is pretty much the end of this part of the presentation, where we kind of derived this description of value as this spectral thing. So now we move on to the Badiou part, right? So from fetishism to phenomenology. If this fetishism is not psychological, then it must be objective in some way, independent of subjectivity, right? And note also that this is a good thing for Marxist critique, right? If we simply stay at the level of psychology, then we fall into the traps of the moralist criticism. We become unable to evaluate strategies because it really just reduces it down to correcting people's thinking, which I think misses the point, right? If you just try to aim at making people think differently, you kind of miss the whole point of this more structural dimension of it. Okay, so there is this benefit in this objectivity of fetishism. And then, so therefore, we need some way of thinking objective appearances, right? What is an objective? What is an appearance that does not appear to anyone in particular? It has to still be an appearance, right? Just like even if no one could see or understand commodity fetishism, it still is active. It still works. Okay, so then I wrote this long slide about Badiou's system, but we don't need to go through every thing here because each point is a super condensed version. But I think starting from the middle, down, there's some important stuff. So there's within the world, there are degrees of appearances. There's a maximal degree and a minimal degree. And we can break down every appearance into smaller appearances. The smallest appearance is an atom, which is the minimally distinct part of a world, and it corresponds to the degree itself, right? It's like between two atoms, or between there's nothing smaller than an atom, because if you were to compare it, you would not have the granularity or the distinctive power to distinguish them, right? So atoms corresponds to the minimum distinguishable element of the world. Yeah, truth is something transworldly, and body is something capable of supporting truths. So that's the core of Badiou's work, those last 2 points, but it's not something that we will address right now.
Yeah, but I think that it's the two crucial. Actually, I would start from 3 points up. I mean, I agree that the whole mechanism behind the idea that have this absolute, you have this sort of indeterminate theory of multiplicities, which is at the level of being. We can only have a theory at the level of how multiplicities are counted into one, and that this is called situations. So we have a theory of situations, and that in logics of worlds, situations are thought of in terms of worlds. But I think that the definition of world, intensity, and transcendentals, you need to provide that before, because so a world is both a given multiplicity and mapped. So in relation to, in a sort of mapping to whatever it is a transcendental is. And the transcendental is concerned with the intensity, right, of the parts of that situation or world. But that statement about anything that can be distinguished by intensity is called an appearance in a world. It's basically stating that you need to be able to put, let's say, you have a world when you have a certain situation, a set. You have a measuring stick that doesn't really measure, let's say that can put into a partial order whatever elements of that situation, right?
Yeah.
Intensity here means that I can write down relations within a world in terms of greater or lesser than something.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that's a crucial clarification, right? For Badiou, a theory of appearance and is one that defines a world in terms of a way of counting a multiplicity. So to count a multiplicity in a given way, whatever way that is to call it a situation. To ascribe that counted situation some measuring stick is to give it a transcendental. Right? To have a situation and a measuring stick is to have a world. Right? And what you call intensity is, let's say, the inner grammar of that measuring stick, right?
Yeah.
Whatever criteria of ordering that we can give to it.
Yeah.
It's
exactly.
not a delusion sense of where more intense, less intense is itself something that's meaningful. Like intensity here means simply that I can put those parts of a situation into a relation of order, but that relation of order can be greater than, smaller than, higher, smaller, more or less value? We don't know, but the content of intensity is still to be defined, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a very general idea of order.
Yeah.
It's not not to be reduced to simply assigning everything a number. Oh, this is intensity of 5 and this is intensity of 6. Therefore, one is more intense than another. But rather, that things can simply be compared.
Yeah, I think that's important because there is, let's say, the Deleuzean approach where intensity is itself a form of measure. So you can talk about intensive change without really defining the attribute that's being greater or less. Like intensity is something in itself, whereas here is just, let's say, the name of whatever order you might assign to it. The possibility of evaluating things in an ordered way. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this also bears onto Badiou's notion of change, where changing the world means for Badiou, in the strong sense, it means changing the ordering, but it doesn't necessarily mean making one thing more intense than another in particular, right? It's about affecting a change in the ordering itself, the structure of the ordering, the way that map functions, let's say. So
sorry, this just leads me to a question that I wanted to ask before we move on, is that if we accept this way of defining things, like, so situation is stuff considered together in some sense, stuff plus a boundary, so some unity. Then stuff bounded by some unity, so a situation plus a measuring device, so, or some evaluatory principle, right, which is a way of naming a transcendental in a simpler way. Stuff plus a transcendental, then that's a world, right? So a world, just by following this, what intensity means, the criteria of order from that evaluatory perspective, right?
Yeah.
Order from within a criteria, whatever that is. Then the question that I wanted to ask is that, as you said, okay, so this criteria does not need to be, for example, length is a criteria, a transcendental for a world, for example, the world of material objects, and we can ask of them what's their length, how big they are, how small they are. There is intensity, but you can think the intensity of appearance in terms of how they appear as big or small.
Yeah.
Right? And then you can consider them as parts, but also as composite parts, because I can ask about, if I have a ruler, if I have a pencil and computer in my table, I can ask the length of the pencil with relation to the computer, and I can also ask the length of the pencil with the computer, so I can form larger composites.
Yes.
The problem that I wanted to get at is that the atom is a complicated notion, because the minimally distinct part is both, let's say, it's both the smallest part I can measure within that transcendental. So it's a smaller part to which I can assign proper intensity, but it's also almost indistinguishable from the unity of measurement. Right? I mean, the minimally distinct part of a world is also almost a unit, just like when we get to Planck distance, which is the minimal amount of distance we can think of in physical world. We're both finding, let's say, we're measuring a part of the world, but we're also finding let's say, a reliable measuring stick. If we wanted to talk about absolute measure, absolute length, the best we can do is to measure things in terms of Planck distance. This thing has, I don't know how many Planck lengths, right? Millions and millions of it. So I just find it interesting that the point of atomic discretion, right, where things are atomically distinct from each other, from a given measure perspective, it's also a place where the measure itself is very much at stake. The criteria of measure, right?
Yeah. If you know the atom, then you kind of know the unit of measurement. Yeah. And it goes with the idea that you mentioned earlier of the stick measuring. How do you say it? Like in the kingdom, you use the foot of the king is used to measure all lengths, right? But then what happens if the foot of the king becomes sore or like swollen? Then, how do you get that minimal independence between them? That question has to do with the atom, I think, where you simply cannot recognize it if it's below this level.
Okay. Yeah, it's I just wanted to like try to translate this presentation into terms that I think makes it easier to.
I think it's also another thing that to complicate it even further is if we think about not only these total orderings, because length is totally ordered. Any given lengths can be compared, but the partial ordering that Badiou uses is a weaker form, where you have things that cannot be compared. Necessarily, not everything must be comparable.
Directly comparable, right?
Directly comparable, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the distinction important, right? But I'm not sure if you're going to go into it now.
Well, just pointing out that there can be multiple atoms. There doesn't have to be one.
Sure.
Yeah, it can be multiple things that are minimally distinct, right above invisible, right?
Yeah, because so the point is that because he deals with partial ordering rather than fully ordered sticks, measuring or evaluation methods for a world, he doesn't. I mean, he goes beyond what we could call natural situations, where you have this absolute transitivity between parts of a situation, right?
Yeah.
For all historical disciplines and all historical worlds, it's evident that I cannot measure the relation between two political statements or all social facts. But the only thing he's requiring, it's a weaker that there be a partial order means that I can find a path that's mediated by several comparisons, so that a part of this can be compared to a part of that, right?
Yeah. You'd have to go to a higher level, like the common element or something, to find a comparison. Yeah. Okay. So given this system, which again we just breezed over, it's not complete, so we can always go back here and try to see what's important for us. But I just wanted to have the basic outline for the later part. So now I want to describe capitalism as a world, right? Given this definition that Badiou provides, I give these three propositions, which are not, unique to me, but derived from the earlier part with discussion of Marx. So proposition 1 is that value is the transcendental of the capitalist world. So what does that mean? Value is the organizing principle. Value is the degree of intensity, or allows us to distinguish degrees of intensity in this world. Remember, value being, everything we discussed about labor, time, which is the magnitude, but also the substance question, right? What do commodities have in common? And then proposition 2 is that capitalism as a world consists of everything which can be exchanged, right? That actually follows from value is transcendental. Things can only have value if they're exchanged, because value is verified. Value is produced in production, but only verified in exchange, and you need both production and exchange to describe value, right? It's a circuit. So, anything that can be exchanged has some degree of existence. And then proposition 3 is that in capitalism, money has maximal existence, right? Because money it has maximal existence in the sense that it can be exchanged for anything.
So I think that's the point, right? You have this is really nice, because now you can see the passage from what you're talking about, partial order and a total ordering, because exchange without money is it's clearly partially ordered, because let's say I can exchange, I have something, and let's say you don't want what I have, the commodity I have, but Caron does. So I exchange with him, and then the commodity that I get from him, I can exchange with you.
Yeah.
So there is no direct degree of comparison between what I have and you have.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's not totally ordered. I cannot find a relation between us, but I can find an intermediate one between me and Caron, and then Caron and me together with you, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas once you have money, all of this is projected onto one commodity because it's absolutely exchangeable.
Yes.
And in that sense, all of them acquire a direct relation, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We could put it this way, that your degree of intensity is directly correlated to the set of exchangeable commodities that you have, right? The definition we had earlier of exchange value is a set of other commodities which I can exchange for a given commodity. Right, like you said, you don't need everything, all commodities. You only need a small set of commodities. So those are only ones you're willing to exchange for. And Caron also has a set of commodities that he's willing to exchange for. I do as well. So, but those sets aren't necessarily overlapping.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So actually, at the level of exchange, I mean, what we're saying is that there is no guarantee that the collection of markets forms a world.
Yeah.
Right. So because the market where Caron and I can exchange, the market where you and I can exchange, and the market where you and him can exchange, and everyone else, they don't guarantee a path connecting them all.
Yeah.
Whereas when money comes into the picture, then we are sure that this can, let's say, that this measuring stick itself exists in the world, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I tried in these propositions, or in thinking this, we have to be careful not to presuppose money as already being the measuring stick. I think that's why it's better to say value is transcendental and money has maximal existence, rather than saying money is transcendental and then you just do away with the idea of value entirely. I think that puts us in line with the previous problems that we were talking about. At least we can elaborate those problems in this, using this framework.
Yeah, but then I would even exchange perhaps the order of propositions, because 2 and 3, proposition 1, value is transcendental. I agree in the sense that value is, let's say, value is a valuation principle for the relation between commodities.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's transcendental in that sense. It's an evaluatory order. Nothing guarantees that it forms a world yet, or that everything can fall into it, meaning that it has such a broad envelope to include everything.
Yeah.
So proposition 2 does not follow from proposition 1.
Okay. Yeah.
Meaning a market is a world where everything can be exchanged according to value. Sure. But capitalism is a world in which we are assured beforehand that everything falls into it. Right? There, like, everything can fall into something. Like, everything can be exchanged. Does not guarantee that it can all be exchanged, and we can, let's say, recognize one ordering principle, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So actually, well, if we're saying these propositions are discussing the emergence of capitalism as a world, I was really not ordering them. I was just saying there are 3 unordered propositions regarding the already existing capitalist world. But yeah, I see what you're saying. The money, you have to have the existence of money in order to account for these indirect forms of exchange, where we have disjunct sets of exchange, and how do we glue these disjunct sets together?
Yeah, exactly. Like
one,
you can have pockets of exchangeability. That doesn't require that all those exchangeable relations, they all are mappable into one transcendental.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One commodity being this universal commodity, to be able to have a universal transcendental for all those exchangeable relations.
Yeah, I think here Badiou has a term which I didn't cover yet, but the term of envelope or enveloping things. I think that's something to look into. But this idea that given any set of degrees in the transcendental, we can find a degree which is greater than all of those degrees, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So we can say money has the maximum enveloping capacity, because given any set of, like, you can now choose any arbitrary set of commodities, and we'll find something that let's say is greater than that, greater than or equal to that set.
Yeah, because you know why? Because why is this, I think, crucial? Because you have value in pre-capitalist societies. It just means that something is being exchanged for something else based on its use value for others.
Mm-hmm.
And we found a balance point. Like, for example, I'm from a tribe, Caron is from another. We do what it was called silent trade. I take like a lighter for him and I put it in a kind of set spot. We don't meet. I put like 3 lighters. He comes and he wants the lighters, and he leaves something else in its place that he thinks has the same value, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these 2 normative principles are meeting at that point, and the commodities, the things themselves are being compared. That's already, let's say, that already presupposes a minimal form of equation between 2 things.
Yeah.
That is not like based on the gift or anything like this. The thing with money is that it turns this qualitative comparison into a quantitative comparison, right? Once you have the price of things, meaning their exchangeability based on one commodity and the quantity of that commodity, you've turned quality into quantity. So the question of can I exchange like 3 lucky strikes for a car? No, you cannot. But 3 lucky strikes are worth $5. A car is worth 5,000. So if you have enough of it, you can exchange. So it becomes just a matter of quantity. It's this passage from quality to quantity that guarantees that anything can be exchanged, or anything can be represented as an exchange.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that the variation of money, all qualitative distinctions become quantitative distinctions of money, right? I think that's that's what guarantees the envelope, that anything that appears in the situation, insofar as it's counted as value, it will be able to be measured by money.
Yeah, I think it'd be nice to try to formalize this further, to say that any envelope implies this ability. Like, even if we weren't talking about money, if we were talking about any other world in Badiou's system, although not every world has this idea of exchange, but this, at least the idea of if you have an envelope, that means that you have a path between any 2, let's say, nodes in this world.
Mm-hmm.
through the envelope, something like that. Yeah, the envelope is like a path. It generates a path of some kind. I don't know, but I like that idea. So the proposition 2 simply allows us to describe the paths or the circuits that enable this quantification of value. Great. So here again, we shift to another section of the presentation. I don't know if we have enough time, but
Caron might be asleep. I'm not sure. He hasn't really manifested recently. I'm not sure if he's awake, but I'm fine with
okay.
Time-wise.
I am awake. Yes.
Great.
And I'm listening. Just I got behind because you have much more in common when it comes to your dialogue than myself. So I have to keep up and listen to this again. So that's a problem. But I'm listening. Yes.
But I think it would be good for you to intervene, just because I agree that, I mean, the things that Dennis is presupposing are actually not that clear. So perhaps also going smaller steps would also, like, the questions you have might also be helpful, because
Yeah. Bit of an echo thing, like.
I mean, the Badiou thing. I haven't got a very good grasp of logical flow, so you lost me there. I mean, I don't really know what is meant by an atom and all of that, but I think you've explained sufficiently for now. Just it's just that I have to do some homework. That's it.
Okay.
I don't think you can explain it more. I think without me grappling with the text itself. So I have to go in and read it. That's it.
Yeah, I think that's true with Badiou. I mean, to some level, it does require like actually engaging with his text. But I wanted to just grab the basic vocabulary so that later on.
Yes, schematically, I had a grasp of somewhat of the ontology you are proposing, the cross references with the Marxist ideas. It's clear enough, but not enough for me to engage with it productively as Gabriel is doing. I mean, asking questions and proposing proposing something. Beyond what you are saying. I mean, I understand it, but it's just the level of understanding, really, just not really being able to apply it and to suggest new applications or something like that.
We were discussing this with Gabriel before, but I think one nice way to know if this whole thing is working is if we can take out this slide about Badiou system and still at the end come up with Badiou system at like once everything's presented. Like you shouldn't need to understand Badiou to like understand the rest of this presentation. I think if
I think we need it, because the propositions all they presuppose Badiou system. I don't think we can jump from the Marxian ideas to these propositions. I think I mean, yeah,
true. I see your point.
I mean, yes, value is transcendental, okay, but money has maximal existence. I don't. Without a Badiou bit, I don't understand what maximal existence means. If you jump directly from Marx,
I totally agree with Caron that, for example, I think these three propositions, they could be rewritten. A good exercise would be to rewrite them without any Badiou lingo, and just put between brackets what concept you think clarifies what that means. Like, because value is the criteria for what appears in the market, or value is let's say an evaluation principle. Money is always evaluatable. I think that already takes out the lingo. It makes it clearer that like the debate with Marxism becomes more palpable. And then we can ask questions about, like, do we have a good theory of what it means to evaluate something? Do we have a good theory of what it means to be always evaluatable or always convertible in those terms, right?
Yeah, that's good.
I think proposition one basically means this, like.
Because the propositions are couched in an ontological vocabulary that's not there in Marx. Existence, world, it's not really there. So you arrive at it by means of Badiou, at vocabulary at least. So it's not something that can be excised from your presentation as it is. I mean,
yeah, I think, yeah, I agree with that. I think I should be able to formulate this without any description of Badiou, because I think, yeah, Badiou's framework is not supposed to be applied in the way that you take his ideas and then shape something to fit them. I think it's rather that things already fit Badiou's system, and we don't need to do any extra work there, except, as Gabriel said, to have some footnotes to say, oh, by the way, you can understand this through Badiou's system. Okay, yeah, but yeah, that's something for me to consider. How can I remove the references?
Yeah, I think that would be a good exercise, man. And also, I mean, just to what I was thinking here, but again, it does connect with Badiou a bit, is that Badiou has this distinction between, okay, it's like, if you go slowly, I can see that there is something that I think you should consider, which is the fact that for Badiou, I mean, we were talking about this. We don't even need Badiou, but it's important. Like, when we were talking about value and like, oh, how labor time is paid, right? The question we were asking was, what is it that the capitalist or the employer recognize as one of the elements that will determine the price of labor? And we said, well, it's all the commodities that the laborer requires. And everything that doesn't have the commodity form does not count for the wage. So what's at stake there is the idea that if something is not commodifiable, if we don't know how much it costs, it doesn't exist in that sense.
Yes.
So it will be at the margin of the capitalist world. So invisible, like the word invisible work connected to domestic work, for example. The word invisible is important there. It's the sense of not counted, right? Doesn't mean that it's not determining, but its effects will be felt without it itself being counted. So there is a sense in which commodification is not really a matter of appearance, but a matter of being, because if something does not exist as commodity, in a certain sense, it does not exist for a certain logic, right? So commodification appears there a more of ontological sense in what Badiou would call, right, the count as one, right? To be able to commodify is to count as something, right? So that's prior to the question of world, right? So situations in capitalism, situations in the world of what we call capitalist social world, are ones where, things that participate in it or that will be given existence are the ones that are directly or indirectly commodified. So the environment, invisible work, popular strategies to deal with precarious conditions, all of those things, because they are, let's say, dissociated from commodity form, they are also dissociated. They are not accountable. The world is not accountable for them. Right? So there is a dimension where commodities concerns the very forming of social situations. So what counts in those situations? Then on top of this, does that make sense?
Go ahead. Yeah, but I still think, like, well, I mean, that sense of being invisible, it's something that anyone can understand, I think, without any reference even to Marx.
Sure. But I think I like this idea of talking about, I just wanted to distinguish between situation, or what counts, right, and how it appears. Because to count for Badiou concerns ontology, right? And we have to answer to the question, how does this count in a world? Or that's the problem of what not how it exists or if it exists in this sort of how it appears, but a question about its being, right?
Yeah.
For example, immigrants women, and all the categories that Foucault studied as well, they all, in a certain sense, don't exist in terms of the logic of production. Productive situation of commodities kind of works itself. It's a different form of invisibility. Value is invisible in the sense that it's criteria for the world and not a part of it. But feminine work, immigrants, and race, and so on, those things they're invisible in a different sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like so there's an importance there between, let's say, what are the principles of belonging to the dynamic of capitalism, which I think concerns the commodity form, and the things that, and how does a situation structured by the commodity form appear for itself? Then we get into the appearance problem and the world problem. Because then the question is, I can have a world where everything, like, let's say, markets are situated places, they were at least, like a place you go with your commodity. In that little corner of the world where you just enter the market in a small city, nobody gives a shit how you produce those things. If you use slave labor, if you kill people, that doesn't exist when you come to exchange commodities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is an inside and an outside of that realm. Very much like, let's say, the art world. You can say, look, when you're thinking about the history of art, it doesn't count if you kill people to do that work, or if whatever, what you thought about it when you were doing it. It counts that the work is there, and it relates to the history of some tradition in painting, and that it figures things in this or that way. What is visible, what exists for that situation, are things counted in this way, where whatever is not counted in that way simply doesn't exist for it. Then the question becomes, okay, that's a matter of how you structure a situation for the market, right? Mm-hmm. To be in the market means to be a commodity. That's it. Anything that is not a commodity doesn't count market-wise. That's not yet the question of appearance. That's the question of being, right? In a very vague, we don't need to define in which sense, but just to be a part of a market, to belong to a market, is to be counted as a commodity. So a market situation is one where things are counted as commodities. Now, is the market a world? Not true, because I can talk about things that cannot be enveloped by a market. Or at least we can say that I can have several markets and they are not commensurate with each other. The slave market can be incommensurate with a different market of immediate goods, or a farmer in some European country. They don't sell people there. So nothing guarantees that slave markets and, let's say, the market for foods in a feudal city, they are the same. They're not. There's no path that will lead one to the other. So the fact that I have a situation where things count as commodities does not guarantee that they're all the same situation. But if you have exchange mediated through money, and exchanges are not between commodities directly, but indirectly, right? I bring my commodity, I sell them for money. Now I take that money and I spend it anywhere I want. I can go from one market to the other, and I sold food and I got money. I used the money to buy a slave. Through money, I connected two markets that could never be directly connected. Mm-hmm. Now, the idea of world money is, by definition, the idea that any two markets with incommensurate commodity relations can be connected, because the world money is a universally exchangeable commodity, not only in that market, right? So, for example, I can have a country that has an internal market, a national market, where, following the national customs, we are against slavery, but it produces a certain amount of money. It's convertible into world money, and then I go to another place where you still have, or have again, slave trade, for example, Syria with the refugees, and I can buy people.
Mm-hmm.
And while I still can say that those markets are, by their own standards, incommensurate, from the standpoint of money, they form a capitalist world. So what I wanted to get at is that there is a nice distinction to be made between these market situations, right, where things to count in them, they must be commodities. That does not guarantee as of itself that the markets organized by this principle, what the only things that count in these spaces are commodities. That doesn't guarantee that they are relatable, directly relatable, or that they are all the same world or same situation.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a second step, which is something must appear within each of these markets that allows me to put them all into a relation, right?
Yeah.
So
can we have something appearing without being?
you can have something for Badiou, you can have something appear in a world without being, in the sense that it will have minimal existence. For example, in the situation where only things that are commodities count in a market, well, the laborer is many things that it's not just a commodity. They only count insofar as he's a commodity. But that set that was counted only for that property, right? Like, for example, in a factory, the laborer only counts as commodity, as labor force. You talk to them, you organize their place and how much time they spend in the factory based on labor force and labor time. But the guy has a bunch of properties that are not counted by the situation. So, but you call that a subset at the edge of the void, like something that, from the standpoint of that situation, is void of any more properties. You don't count that set in any other way other than the one you already did. Like, it's a laborer. There's nothing more to that characteristic, but a different transcendental could extract more information. But then you are, by the very recognition that that thing has further determination, means that you need to change the transcendental, right? You need to evaluate from a different principle.
And what's the transcendental exactly?
So it's a criteria. The transcendental is a criteria through which you evaluate the relations within a situation.
Okay.
So since in the factory you're evaluating the relation between commodities and their capacity for production, the fact the laborer speaks Swahili and the other speaks English, or that he's sick, or that he's dissatisfied with his work, might even count for, let's say, human resources, because it might affect productivity. But that's the only dimension of determinations that do count, right? I mean, another way of saying this is saying, for example, in the world, in a situation or a world of figurative painting, certain properties of color don't count. Of course, color counts. If you're painting a red boat, you need it to be red. But let's say the thickness of paint might have a very low degree of intensity in that world. It doesn't really mean much, right? It doesn't count for much. A change in the transcendental, so to approach the same material from the standpoint of abstract painting, suddenly the inner properties of that set of red paint count much more than the fact it was a red boat that you painted.
So a transcendental is kind of, it's like a frame of reference where you change the frame of reference and different elements get singled out by the frame of reference.
Yeah. You can distinguish more or less. Depending on how fine-grained your transcendental is, the more distinctions you can make within the world. Yeah. Because Badiou talks about the most basic transcendental would be the binary one. Pretty much it is or it isn't, right? So under that, I don't know, I guess you could say maybe like machines, you could view machines as zeros and ones, right? So in that world, it's either on or off. That's the most basic transcendental. But then there's many other transcendentals which have more degrees of description. Yeah.
Yeah. So the point is that he separates between the question of what counts and the question of the frame of reference over what counts, right? So a situation is defined by this belonging structure. So what belongs to a situation? But
what counts determines the situation, because it is what belongs to the situation.
Exactly.
From what I understand from being an event, which I have read, so I have a better grasp of it. I just didn't read the Logic of Worlds.
Yeah, I mean the only difference, man, is that once you ask the question, what counts, what belongs to a situation, there's still the question that you can ask of how is the infrastructure of that situation organized, right? Let's say you choose a prime numbers. That's a way of belonging to a situation. All the prime numbers belong to the situation. You have a criteria for what counts. You know, number 4 will not count in this situation. Only prime numbers. But then there's still the question of how are they related? That's a separate question. So
what's a world exactly?
Is the framework that evaluates relations between things in a situation.
Okay.
So that's
a world in a sense is smaller than the situation.
No, well, strictly, I think you could say that the world is the map from things to a transcendental. So if you were to...
didn't the transcendental define the situation? I mean, if you say prime numbers, the definition of prime numbers isn't the transcendental, is a frame of reference whereby you are defining a situation.
No,
so,
but, yeah, because for Badiou, the distinction there goes in the sense of the definition of the situation is intrinsic, meaning it's based on this belonging property. It belongs or it doesn't belong. Now, once you have a set of things that belong, for example, you can have multiple ways of mapping those things together.
I see.
Right? So from being an event, I would say that the transcendental is much closer to what he used to call the state. So the frame of reference here is not in the sense of, because you can collect things together that you cannot really define how they go together. So for example, you can glue together all paintings, like in the sense, collect all paintings, but how you will order them, under which frame of reference you will order them, like the world of figurative painting. Well, in that world, abstract paintings will sound like child's play and stupid stuff, and people who don't want to follow the rules or whatever, like the inner determinations of abstract paintings will become vague, and you won't speak of them, like they won't be relevant, right? Whereas some paintings will be much more intense in appearance within that world. So there is a distinction between belonging and appearing in that sense, right? Belonging concerns simply if you collect them or not, and appearance is the frame of reference in the sense that you will assign some ordering principle to whatever it is that you collected.
So in other words, the frame of reference isn't really defining the domain. I mean,
no, it's defining
the domain is given. The domain is somewhat given, and then you can map the domain by any property you can grasp.
Yeah.
So the chosen property will be a transcendental, and it defines a world if you can have the domain well ordered. I mean, something like that.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay. So the first point is that the ways you define are secondary to the things that they're defining on. So the domain is a problem of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And the definition, as you call it, or the frame of reference, concerns, let's say, the transcendental of a world. But what Badiou calls the transcendental doesn't need to be a fully fledged, final, complete ordering. It's not a totally order. So you don't need
you can have a partial order. Yeah, I grasp there. Yeah,
exactly. So you can have you can have like smaller measuring sticks that somehow are related indirectly. You don't need to have a perfect measuring for everything, right? So it's a weaker condition.
So by transitivity, you can have everything measured by different criteria from A to B, then from B to C, but not from A to C.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's enough.
And that makes a world.
Exactly. A world will be something that has those two things. It has a domain defined by a logic of presentation and belonging, and it has an additional structure, right, defined by a certain set of orderings that themselves have some relation between them. The reason why I wanted to go back to this is that if you take all of this machinery, you see that there is a question of market spaces, I would call, like the situation, which is the space of the market, and what counts in the market, and the question of the, let's say, the appearance or the world of capitalism. I think those are distinct questions, you know?
Yeah.
To belong to a market is to be a commodity. That's a domain question concerning the domain. The question concerning how things that belong to markets relate, that will be a history of how the market becomes a world market and a world economy.
Yeah, I see the problem.
Right, and that's why, I mean, his whole concern is, that's the whole discussion of sheaves in logics of worlds, is because, well, these things are glued together in ways that they're not perfectly stitched together as if one is totalizing on the other. You can actually stitch things together and come up with a universal principle that was not simply visible, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good, interesting question, because finding different ways of stitching things together, that was not possible in being an event version of Badiou's system. You didn't really have that. Like, you had a notion of event and then like consequence and so on. So you could formalize like something happening, but in terms of like building a different logic to govern the world, a different frame of reference, like you said, building that different frame of reference, that's something that you can only think in logics of worlds, I think.
Yeah, it's very much a theory of world building.
Yeah.
But to go back to Marx, I think that this translates into my Marxist critique of the three propositions, not Badiouian one, which is within the space of markets, you can have you have commodities as a condition. Mm-hmm. Markets are conditioned by commodities.
Yeah.
The market space is defined by that space in which only commodities count. And it's essential within that logic of markets, the fact that money is a commodity. Money is just a special commodity, right? So we move from exchange to price in that sense. I can have a small market where everything are commodities, and I can choose one of those commodities to function as money. The thing about world money, right, is that it's a commodity that is no longer, its function as money is not really stuck to one market space, but it becomes that commodity that in all market spaces functions as money. So it starts to glue together separate markets.
Yeah, but why is that a critique? Isn't that exactly what I'm saying?
I'm critiquing of the way you formulated it.
Ah, okay, yeah, you mean the order I formulated it.
Yeah, because then, I mean, I'm still going through the relation between propositions 1, 2, and 3, because then you can see that, well, within the market space, it's true, value was the organizing principle, the evaluatory principle, because things belong to it because they're commodities, but they are evaluated due to their value. And within this realm, money can appear. Now, the third proposition, so money has maximal existence, so money is absolutely evaluatable within a market. But you get capitalism when markets, any market you can come up with, can be evaluated by money.
Guys, I got to go in like 15 minutes.
Sure.
But sorry, continue what you were saying.
I'm just saying that capitalism is, as a world, consists of everything that can be exchanged. I think that you can have there a granular kind of a intermediary property, right? Because it's true, I agree, but this everything can be exchanged.
I see.
It's the fact that capitalism is a world where money can glue any market together, right?
Right. Okay, I see. Yeah. It's more complicated than simply everything can be exchanged. You need the physical incarnation of the stitching procedure to guarantee that any new market that forms can be stitched to the existing one, right? Because if you simply say, "Oh, we have a world, everything can be exchanged," well, what if I introduce a totally new commodity and it's only exchangeable by one other commodity or something like that? Then haven't I made just a separate world? Mm-hmm. No, you need some mechanism to say, well, no, capitalism can just absorb that new commodity via money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because what is hard for me to understand is that when you define like value is a frame of reference or this evaluatory principle, that means that it's, let's say, this infrastructure of a market. It's implied by the very relation between commodities. I agree with that, but it's the weird thing is that you find that there is more, let's say, there is a physical condition to this, or a concrete condition, which is this can only be expanded ad infinitum because there is a commodity, a particular one, that can appear in different market worlds, right? It cannot appear in any world. It can only appear in worlds in which commodity defines what belongs. But given that, that's why it's not truth for Badiou, right? For Badiou, truths are transworldly in the sense that worlds with no similar transcendentals still can be affected by whatever is that it's true. But money is a truth of market worlds, right? It can appear in any market.
Right.
No, so I think that's a relevant intermediate step. But could you, before you go, just tell us what you were going to do with the Krause thing?
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to, so now that we've seen Marxist construction, I wanted to shift to Ulrich Krause's model, where he kind of derives exactly what we've been saying, this passage from 1, 2, and 3. I think by the end of his chapter 2, he describes exactly the stitching process in great detail, using, and he uses a lot of math. So I didn't have time to actually fully get all this, but I did put down his basic formulas, and I wanted to just discuss it so we can have a better idea of what it means to have markets being compatible with one another, right? Because on this line of thinking, he goes even more low level, because he's talking about individual acts of exchange, right? Like between the three of us, I can exchange with Gabriel, Gabriel can exchange with Caron, Caron can exchange with me, but that doesn't necessarily make this a consistent system of exchange. So until we have money, we have a problem here. So he derives this necessity from some basic mathematical principles. I think once we go through that, we basically have a mathematical model that fits everything that we talked about before. Yeah, I mean, we can just look at the first slide here. He has a basic system of the economy where you have inputs, so that the economy itself is this cycle, right? PE, and it just reproduces itself. But you have inputs, which are labor, and then outputs, which are consumption. So this chain moves on its own, but it requires this input-output structure as well. So that this also adds on to our definition of capitalism as a world, because it's not simply, in order to say capitalism world where everything is exchangeable for anything else, be it money, you still need to consider production and consumption. And the difference between, let's say, Krauss's model for any economy whatsoever is that the middle term between production, distribution, consumption, distribution is specifically exchange, right? We distribute the things that we produce via exchanging them, right? I mean, and this is already something that Marx is built into Marx's definition, but I think Krauss shows very well the consequence of this. When we distribute through exchange, we get this. We run into the problem of, like I said, incomplete exchanges. Not anything can be exchanged for anything else, so we cannot really distribute things completely, right? We can only distribute along what people are willing to exchange. So you need money to make this passage. Okay, but that's a very quick summary of it. Yeah, but I think it's actually good that we stop here, because I need to finish the book and kind of absorb some more from what he's saying to make this like really connect with the previous slides.
But like just from this slide, I remember from his book that he shows that you can have markets, meaning spaces where only everything that is there to be exchanged. So everything that is there counts as commodities. But this will be complete, one-to-one, homogeneous. Sorry, no, they will be. They have some properties that still create inconsistencies, right? Like the fact that A can exchange with B, B can exchange with C, doesn't guarantee that A can exchange with C.
Yeah.
And he says, well, money is required to turn to create consistency within these spaces, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but what he calls making these spaces consistent is precisely what will lead us to make them into a world in Badiou's sense, because making them consistent means creating a valuation of this exchange space that can all be mapped onto some particular, all expressed into some in terms of the exchange of one thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to go through this slowly later on.
Yeah, and really, it's nice. He's done a lot of the work that I wanted, or I planned to do myself, or hope that I would be able to do. He's done a lot of the mathematical work that makes it very easy to make the passage from Marx to Badiou and back, and then also, really gives a strong foundation for any kind of discussion of like a different way of organizing this kind of stuff, I think.
Yeah, I can definitely see now the connection between them, like the way you presented today. I think that it makes, from what I read from Krause, I can see how you can interpret his formalism in these terms,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it would be good to go slowly through. I think it would be good, like I know you have already a presentation, like on some parts of being an event in logics of world, it would be good to go through that machinery more slowly and then go through his stuff,
Mm-hmm.
You mean through Krause's stuff?
Yeah, like this construction from Krause, perhaps even before, and then like actually go slowly through logics of roles and things like this, so we have a better grasp on how they can relate,
Yeah, definitely. For me, that would be very good, I think.
Yeah, I think the Badu stuff, yeah, we can revisit that later. Yeah. I think next time I'll probably focus more on Krause, and then because I think jumping
it's a missing part of today's section actually. So and it looks like something we have to go really slowly. So into it.
Okay, guys. Well, thank you for listening and contributing a lot.
Do you want to schedule the next one? How are we to go through this? Because
we had two kind of concrete issues to address really quickly. One is like, are we then meeting in 15 days, and who is presenting?
Yeah, I wanted to present because I have this job thing going on, so I would like to have something in English to show to show them. So this would be very useful for me, but I mean it's not that pressing as well. So I could wait a little longer if necessary. But
no, but so I think I'm fine with that. How about then in 2 weeks, Caron presents then?
Yeah, I can do that. Like it's the 6th April.
Yeah, works for me. I'll get
your calendar. Yeah, the 6th. So
great. And also the second thing is I asked you guys about this. Like, I know Reza Naderi is interested in joining. I used to meet him every week or so to talk about his work, but it's very hard to keep a lot of meetings open, and there are a lot of relations between what he's working on and all these discussions. I think that he could help us out with a lot of the stuff we're working on, and he would also benefit from it. So I was wondering if you guys are okay with bringing him in. The question for me is Agon has this kind of infinite postponement thing. He always said he's going to join, but he never does. So ultimately, I think it would be the 4 of us anyway, Reza and the 3 of us. So it would still stick to the schedule that we first agreed on. That kind of takes 2 months for somebody to present again. But if Agon does join, it would make 75 days between presentations. So that's a very long cycle, I think. It's a kind of perhaps a bit beyond the limit. I'm not sure. So
yeah, I think it's too much. If there's 5 of us, I mean.
Yeah, so I was thinking of
if there's 5 of us, we have to stick to 1 presentation each, I think. Not like a couple of presentations like we are doing now.
Yeah, I think so. And also I would even consider, if we have time, to move it either as a weekly thing, or if we're 5 and we're meeting every 15 days, perhaps consider that cycles can, let's say, we schedule who is next based on who has something to present, so that, let's say, if people are producing quicker than every 75 days, they get to present, like Dennis presented now, Caron presents, I present, and Reza has nothing to present yet, so Dennis goes again.
Yeah, I think that's wise, I think.
Otherwise, if we stick too closely to like this rigorous cycle, there's a chance that it takes 70 days for somebody to present, even though they have stuff to present, and other people will go quicker than they have something,
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it should be more flexible with because everyone has different commitments right now.
Yeah, so I think that could work then. Okay, that's fine by me. But anyway, the next one is on the 6th of April then.
Okay.
Great, guys.
Great.
Thanks, guys.
See you later then.
Yeah, talk to you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.